And I want to just say this too for the listeners. Like, there's a reason why we started with the positive, because I think a lot of our listeners have experienced the negative side of purity culture, and we don't want to throw the whole thing out with the bathwater, right? And so let's get into it now. Purity culture, kind of as we've been discussing it, has downsides. And really, I think this word is important: unintended negative effects.
Yes.
And so what are those, and how do we see those negative impacts playing out today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys have done this recently, but if you Google purity culture, you know how it fills in for you the words.
Yeah.
The second one is trauma, purity culture trauma, and then it just goes down from there. It's crazy, and obviously we know with Joshua Harris and some of the other situations that have, flipped, and as you said, threw the baby out with the bathwater. But there's so much there. I think personally, big picture, there would be kind of two pieces. I would say one, I think a level of unhealthy expectations that if you do this, you're going to have the perfect marriage and the perfect sex life. Like, you're guaranteed that, on a level that just isn't realistic, because we live in a fallen world. And I know a lot of people that was a big issue for, that kind of felt they were sold that line and missing the reality of marriage, what it really is.
Totally.
And then the other big one, in my personal opinion, would just be the repression that came with it, that because we didn't know, we're maybe so scared our kids are going to start having sex, that we so repress their sexuality that it becomes an issue where they're repressed, and they end up, bitter, all those things that shame, and not having a place to put their sexual energy in a positive way. Like, a lot of that just wasn't addressed. Those would be the two big ones to me that come to mind initially.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was really the byproduct for me, was that feeling of, unless it was in marriage, and that was obviously when you're a teenager, that's down the road, that feeling that anything sexual, anything that's kind of that fleshly desire, we would call it, it was always viewed as being sinful, as part of our fallenness, as something that was wrong with us and needed to be, avoided, bounce the eyes, don't think about it, turn away, have nothing to do with it. And there are biblical principles there of how we should respond to temptation. But I was never taught that at its root, all of that desire and the stuff happening in my brain and the hormones and the dopamine, like, that God had created that.
Yeah.
And that it was his design, and those things I was feeling was how he had made me. And so rather than seeing it as part of God's goodness, I always saw it as part of my sinfulness.
Right.
And that really became difficult to reconcile in marriage, of like, wait, is this, what part of me is good and pleasing to God because now I'm married, and what is, you kind of still feel like there's this unhealthy sinfulness even in marriage sexuality, and you don't know how to really give yourself permission to be fully alive how God made you within marriage, because you're still battling kind of this is wrong. It's, there's that joke and I think it was Sheila Ray Gregoire that has said it in her book, that, sex is dirty, bad, and evil, so save it for the one you love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you kind of feel that way, like, okay, we went, it's all been red light, red light, red light, don't go, don't touch, don't see, don't have anything to do with.
Yeah.
And then the pastor pronounces I do, your husband and wife, and now it's like green light, and you just go like,
right.
And there were just so many mixed things that happened that no one, and I think this is, to me, another huge downside, no one talked about all the gray area in between sex is for marriage, don't have it until then. All the stuff to do with lust and, masturbation. And I mean, the conversations about that were just so focused on good and bad, sin and righteousness, that I don't think there were any healthy conversations around what did it look like to manage sexuality in a healthy way. And I think we're seeing that in some ways happening for our young adults, people in their 20s and 30s that are single are asking us a lot of hard questions of like, is it even possible to manage my sexuality as a single adult? And I think part of that is because as a teen, they were basically presented a gospel of just wait until you're married.
Right.
And like, I'm not married, and I don't know if I ever will be. What do I do with this whole sexuality thing? And so we didn't learn healthy ways to navigate all of that. I said I think purity culture did teach me that I could be above those urges, but at the same time, I think it taught me a dual message that those urges were really, really powerful, really, really dangerous, and I'd better not ever put myself in a situation like where I was alone with a girl, because I would not be able to control myself.
Yeah.
And so it was all kind of this boundaries-based dating. And I think, as a dad of 4 kids, I think boundaries in dating are really wise. But the reasons for the boundaries, I think, reinforced an idea that your sexuality in the moment of, temptation is way stronger than you are.
Yeah.
And it's really up to you. And I think, back to something you said, Catherine, really putting a lot of emphasis on girls to draw that line, to don't let boys cross, because they can't really help themselves. So you've got to be the one to say no. And it's like, man, that's putting a ton of pressure on a girl and on the boy, reinforcing this negative message that you can't control yourself. You can't make wise decisions. And so I just feel like it left a whole area of gray zones that no one ever talked about. And in those gray zones is where I developed addiction, where I developed really unhealthy patterns. And part of it, you go, well, hey, I'm not having sex. I'm not going out on the weekends like all the other guys on my football team and going to these parties and bragging in the locker room about who they'd slept with and how they'd, even turned it into a competition of who'd been with who. And so there was kind of this righteousness of like, well, I'm not doing all of that, bad stuff that my church has taught me is so wicked and evil. But yet all the things I was doing privately in terms of pornography and lust and fantasy, I had nowhere to go with. Yeah. And so you just kind of stay in that gray zone, and that developed, like I said, a lot of unhealth down the road.
One of the things that you mentioned too with what the church can do inadvertently with men, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I'm thinking now it needs to be a full other episode that we do. But I think that the church does need to take some responsibility on the messages that it communicates to men and women in their churches, and how that impacts that. Because what you're describing is like, my sexuality is like a caged lion, and I better keep it in the cage, do everything I can. I can't trust myself. And to your point, that teaches that it's never something I can control. And then once the lion's out of the cage, it's like, well, I've been trained so long to keep it in there. Like, what do I do now? Like, it's just something that I think that the church needs to maybe start seeing itself and the messages that it gives in that light, that there are things that we can inadvertently cause. The other thing, and I don't think either of you mentioned this in general, but just your entire worth being based on whether you're a virgin or not is something that I heard. And it's something a lot of my friends in church heard. And yes, 1 Corinthians 6, there is a unique aspect to sexual sin and what it does to us as a person and our body. But it is not like the top tier of sin. Like, it's not this elevated thing. And I think it's, today it could be any of the LGBTQ, topics, those conversations, people in those categories, we can view that as like, that is the worst of all worst, and they quote Romans 1, and it's like, okay, I get where you're coming from, but at the same time, like, all of that sin is forgiven at the cross. And that's something that I didn't hear emphasized. What I heard was, be a virgin, oh, you're not, you're bad. And that's like, well, okay, now I'm carrying this moniker around, this scarlet letter for the rest of my life. When, I mean, you can have an incredible relationship with Jesus. You can have a very healthy marriage if you had sex before marriage. Shocker. Alert the media, But I do think that it was so heavily pushed that so much of our self-worth and value is wrapped up in, have I had sex or not?
Yeah, and that was actually one of the common questions that I would get when I went into public schools, was the students asking, and you could see it coming from a place of fear and shame, because they probably had already, and they'd ask me, hey, well, does this mean you're only going to marry a virgin if you're saving yourself? And I said, no, because if I believe, now again, in the public school context, I couldn't give all the godly reasons, but if I was in a youth group, I could say also, I believe in redemption and forgiveness and restoration. And if I say I believe that, I can't say I'm only going to be with someone who's a virgin. And, and I agree that there was a lot of kind of shaming on that was more than necessary, because we believe in a God of redemption and a God of forgiveness. My husband was not a virgin when we got married. I was. And you know what? He would say it was like his first time. God can redeem and bring those things around. So, and I agree, it was definitely overemphasized that way on a level that I think brought extra shame, unnecessary, to people to not see the redemption attribute.